Today is Saturday, February 18th. Americans love football. Last weekend's Super Bowl was the third most watched television event of all time. But despite its popularity, statistics show youth participation in tackle football has trended down in recent years. It seems some parents don't want to let their kids play because of safety concerns. But America is divided on this issue, and the debate is far from over. In fact, even the American Academy of Pediatrics is still debating what the recommendations should be for youth football. Today, we'll hear from one of the people working to craft those guidelines. He's also the team physician for the Iowa Hawkeyes football team. But first, we're talking about specific new data that suggests why some communities are more supportive than others of kids playing tackle football. Mariah Warner is a PhD candidate at The Ohio State University, and she's the lead author of this first-of-its-kind study. Welcome to the Newsworthy Special Edition Saturday, when we sit down with a different expert or celebrity every Saturday to talk about something in the news. Don't forget to tune in every Monday through Friday for our regular episodes, where we provide all the day's news in 10 minutes. I'm Erica Mandy. It's now time for today's Special Edition Saturday. Mariah Warner, thank you so much for coming on the Newsworthy.
Thanks for having me.
So your study looked at whether adults believe tackle football is an appropriate sport for kids to play. Can you tell us about the main takeaways or results from this study?
Over half of respondents, about 55%, somewhat or strongly disagreed that it was appropriate. And then about 45% said it was okay. And then beyond that, we looked at a lot of factors related to why people may think this, and found that, there are a host of patterns of facets of people's identity or aspects of their social structure, how they grew up, things like that really make a difference and are significantly related to how they're going to feel about tackle football.
And I want to dig into that a little bit more, but first I'm curious, has a study like this been done before, and has there been a change over time?
There hasn't really been a study like this done before, but what we can do to kind of get at patterns is look at our data in comparison to participation trends. So we can see that participation in youth tackle football has been declining for quite some time. And so you couple that with, our results that show that people are pretty divided about it, and you can kind of come to a conclusion that people seemingly support it less now than they have in the past.
And you mentioned some of the factors that seem to correlate with how people feel about tackle football for kids, like geography, gender, and race. So can you go through a couple of those, and what did you find?
Football is this very masculine sport. It's played by mostly men, but beyond that, it really emphasizes these masculine ideals about toughness and conflict and hitting. We find that men are more likely to support kids playing football than any other gender identity, but also people who ascribe to these traditional ideas about gender and difference between, women's and men's roles in the world. Ascribing to those things is also associated with more support for tackle football.
And geography, I know football tends to be really big in the South. Is that what you found, that it's more acceptable in the South?
So there wasn't actually too many stark differences in geography when we accounted for all the other factors. The significance of geography kind of drops out a little bit, suggesting that some other things might be important, such as, how big of a fan of football you are, which we know that is associated with geography as well. But yeah, definitely the West being the least supportive of football was kind of one of the things. The South, the Midwest, definitely more South and Middle America is where it seems to be kind of the most entrenched.
Okay, and before we move on, was there any other factor that really stood out to you?
People with sort of conservative political ideologies are really supportive of football, but then also Black folks are more supportive of tackle football than any other racial group. Football is seen in a lot of ways as this potential path for, social or economic mobility. It's a way that folks might think that it's the only opportunity, their child or another child might have to get a scholarship to go to college, to potentially play professionally. So there's these ideas about sport as this, really meritocratic institution and this place for opportunity that leads things like being Black or having a lower income or having less education to also be associated with supporting tackle football.
So you mentioned this, that statistics have shown that the number of kids playing tackle football has declined over the last 2 decades. What do you think is behind that? Is it based on fears over injuries, or is it something else?
So a lot of the anecdotal evidence definitely leads us to think that concern over safety and injuries is a big part of that. some reasoning behind that is we've seen participation in tackle football decline, but participation in sports like flag football go up, suggesting that it's not necessarily this, move away from football altogether and that people just don't like football anymore. That's not the case, as evidenced by things like the Super Bowl being the most watched TV show every year, but that concerns with safety are having, parents maybe move their kids away from tackle football specifically, at least at those younger ages.
And I know you've pointed out that even the athletic director at Ohio State has said that kids younger than 13 should not be playing tackle football, that flag football is a better option for those young kids. What do you make of this? And do you think from the statistics that you're seeing that flag football could eventually replace tackle football?
I certainly think it's starting to do so. And the Ohio State AD isn't the first major person to say that. There's a large number of current and former NFL players who also don't advocate for kids tackling. A lot of them say it's really not necessary. Tom Brady didn't play tackle football until he got into high school. And that obviously, didn't do anything to dissuade his talent. And so, I do think it's a trend that is going to continue. We're seeing more and more leagues offering, even if they do still offer full contact, they're offering flag or limited contact. There's kind of these in-between leagues as well.
But if fewer kids are playing football at a younger age, will that eventually still impact, professional sports? Because maybe fewer people will choose to go into that profession. I don't know. Has that been looked at all? Do we think that eventually it will work its way up to professional football and impact that if fewer kids are playing now?
There isn't necessarily a decline in, older high school and varsity level football, 16, 17-year-olds playing. There's definitely a lot of people that make that transition from flag football until they're 13 and then go on to tackle football at older ages. So while we're seeing these declines in tackle football for particularly young ages, we're not really seeing these declines for older ages. It's not like they're dropping out of football or, out of sports altogether. So I'm not convinced that that'll be the case.
Final thought or just final takeaway about your findings and how, we move forward with American football?
Football is obviously still very popular, but when it comes to kids, there's definitely this move towards, kind of putting safety first.
Still to come, regardless of Americans' perception of the game, how safe is tackle football really for young kids? Turns out there's not just one answer. The Concussion Legacy Foundation says kids should not play tackle football before age 14. But some other organizations disagree, and some haven't weighed in yet. In fact, the American Academy of Pediatrics is still debating the issue right now. Our next guest says to expect those new guidelines within the next year. Dr. Andy Peterson is the head team physician for the Iowa Hawkeyes and the director of the Iowa Sport Concussion Program. His research focuses on youth sports and the validation of sideline concussion tests. Dr. Peterson shares his reasons for allowing kids to play tackle football, and he weighs in on the long-term risks of head injuries, including who is actually most at risk of developing brain diseases like CTE. But first, let's take a quick break to thank our sponsors. The Newsworthy is brought to you by Indeed. You almost never hear in the headlines that great leaders did everything on their own. And there's a reason for that. Great businesses have great teams. And to build a great team, you need Indeed. Indeed is the hiring platform where you can attract, interview, and hire all in one place. So don't spend hours on multiple job sites looking for candidates with the right skills when you can do it all with Indeed. Find top talent fast with Indeed's suite of powerful hiring tools like Indeed Instant Match, assessments, and virtual interviews. Hate waiting? Indeed's U.S. data shows over 80% of Indeed employers find quality candidates whose resume on Indeed matches their job description the moment they sponsor a job. I love when a platform makes things easy by providing everything you need in one place. Join over 3 million businesses worldwide using Indeed to hire great talent fast. Indeed knows hiring needs to be cost-effective when you're running your own business. So visit Indeed.com/newsworthy to start hiring now. Just go to Indeed.com/newsworthy. Indeed.com/newsworthy. Terms and conditions apply. Cost per application pricing not available for everyone. Need to hire? You need Indeed. And thanks to our other sponsor, ZocDoc. Have you ever gone down a Google or social media rabbit hole looking for answers about a health concern? I know I have. And most of the time, it's not all that helpful, or I find a bunch of conflicting information and feel confused, or I realize there are a bunch of so-called experts who don't really have the credentials I can trust. So if you need answers from someone that is not random on the internet and want a trusted professional, ZocDoc is here to help. You can find a bunch of medical professionals that specialize in the care you need, and you can see their patient reviews right there on ZocDoc before you book. ZocDoc is the only free app that lets you find and book doctors who are patient-reviewed, take your insurance, are available when you need them, and treat almost every condition under the sun. No more doctor roulette or scouring the internet for questionable reviews. Go to ZocDoc.com/newsworthy and download the ZocDoc app for free. Then find and book a top-rated doctor today. Many are available within 24 hours. That's ZocDoc.com/newsworthy. ZocDoc.com/newsworthy. Okay, now to my conversation with Dr. Andy Peterson. Dr. Andy Peterson, thank you so much for coming on the Newsworthy.
Thanks for having me.
So first, in your medical opinion, how risky is it for young kids to play tackle football?
I mean, it depends on what you mean by risky. The injury rates in football are higher than they are in a lot of comparable sports, about twice as high if you compare it to things like soccer and hockey and wrestling and things like that. So I think a lot of kids get into this because they like the idea of hitting people, right? They like the physicality of it. But if your goal is to develop skills, it does make some sense to start with a non-tackling alternative, things like flag football or tackle bar or things like that, because they're going to develop the skills that are going to make them better players later in life without the increased risk of repetitive head injuries.
What age do you recommend that parents allow tackle football? And to be clear, what's the youngest age that kids are actually playing tackle football in America?
Current American Academy of Pediatrics guidance does not recommend for or against tackle football. Even within the author group, right? So even within the author group, we've got folks that are reasonably against tackle football for some of the reasons that have been published, and we got people that are reasonably for it. But we're hoping that within the next year, the American Academy of Pediatrics will have new guidance on tackle football for kids. There's youth football programs that include pads and tackle as young as 5 years old across the country. Very few youth football players are going to make it to the NFL level. But if you look at NFL level, there does seem to be an increased risk of long-term brain injury in folks that started playing tackle football before the age of 12 versus those who didn't. And so, if you have a child that's at risk for having a long playing career, right? So I'm 5'7", my wife is 5 feet tall, we weigh about 150 and 110 pounds. Like, we have zero chance of having a child that's going to play in the NFL. And so I would have no concerns about letting my child start to play early because they don't have the risk of a long playing career. But if you have a kid that you might think might end up having a long playing career, I do think it makes some sense to delay initiation of tackle football.
Okay, so you think it's more about how long they're going to play, not necessarily that their brains haven't fully developed.
It clearly is, right? So if you look at the risk of chronic traumatic encephalopathy, the bad brain problem that we worry about in people who have played contact and collision sports over a lifetime, the biggest risk factor is the duration of their playing career. The average kid that starts playing tackle football early is not going to have a super long playing career and is not at risk of those long-term outcomes. I personally am in favor of not restricting sports for kids, period. I think the benefits of sports participation, the benefits of physical activity outweigh the theoretical risks of contact and collision sports in younger people. Kids that really find a joy or a love of moving really tend to be adults that find a joy or love of moving. And so we don't want to do anything, or at least in my opinion, we don't want to do anything that discourages a kid from doing something physically active. There's also reasonably few sports that really cater to kids that are overweight or obese, right? I mean, if you look at most of our competitive sports in this country, it's hard to be competitive. It's hard to be good at a sport if you carry additional weight. And now with somewhere around 30 to 40% of American youth being overweight or obese, football is one of the few sports where they can be competitive and actually find success. And so we want to make sure that we're being inclusive in how we encourage sport participation. We want to make sure that we're encouraging physical activity, especially in these populations that need it the most.
And so when we're talking about the risk of head injuries, what are some of the long-term complications or risk associated with tackle football?
Yeah, so if you're thinking about concussion in general, the risk is very low. Right? The vast majority of people with sport-related concussion are going to recover quickly and spontaneously. Some of them might need some additional rehabilitation or some additional attention before they return to play. But we don't think that having a handful of concussions as a young person is super risky. One of the benefits of being a child is that your brain is still reasonably plastic, right? It sounds crass, but a kid's brain bounces back a little bit better than an adult's brain does. Now, is that a good reason to put them at risk? No, I don't think that's a good reason to put them at risk. But at the same time, when we think about chronic traumatic encephalopathy, this is primarily a disease of adults who had very long playing careers. There's no reason at this point to think that children with short playing careers are at particular risk for this.
We recently reported on a study from Boston University that found nearly 92% of the brains that were provided from former NFL players had the brain disease CTE. So what do you make of that study and those results, and ultimately the risk of tackle football even in adults, such as, even the college kids that you work with?
We're not talking about CTE in people that only played contact collision sports as younger children, right? We're talking about it in people that had long playing careers, mostly NFL athletes, some college athletes, some wrestlers, some boxers, some rugby players, a few other sports. So since we're talking about the NFL and the Boston Brain Bank study, obviously this is a sample that has significant selection bias. Doesn't mean this isn't a real problem. I'm not disparaging the group. I'm not disparaging or diminishing the reality of chronic traumatic encephalopathy. But we're talking about people who are donating their brains because they are worried they may have this condition. And so when you hear a statistic like 92%, or a couple of years ago it was 97% of the brains donated to the Boston Brain Bank having evidence of chronic traumatic encephalopathy, you got to be a little bit cognizant of the selection bias here. It's not a random sample. These are people that are probably at higher risk to start with.
Final thought or takeaway on the topic of head injuries in football.
The management of concussions, mild traumatic brain injuries, has improved dramatically over the last 20 years. And most athletic trainers are very comfortable with this. Most sports medicine physicians are very comfortable with this. It's a bit of a crapshoot outside of that. There's a lot of generalist family medicine doctors, pediatricians, even neurologists that aren't familiar with the current recommendations and guidance that we have in diagnosis and treatment of sport-related concussion. And so if you have an athlete who has a sport-related concussion, I strongly encourage you to work with somebody who really understands the injury and is able to take you through the process in an evidence-based way.
Well, thank you so much to both of our guests today. For more about both of their research efforts, you can check out the links in our episode notes. And if you found this information interesting or valuable, we always encourage you to share it with a friend or on social media. Thank you so much in advance. As always, join us during the week for our 10-minute news roundups, available every Monday through Friday morning. And we'll be back Monday to keep you in the know. Until then, have a great weekend.